The sky was the first thing we noticed. It always is. Not the way you'd notice a sunset or a dawn, or even the clouds before a storm. No, the sky was swollen and bruised, the kind that sagged under its own weight, choked with ash and smoke. It pressed down on us, as if the very air wanted to smother the life out of our lungs before the war even began. The smell was copper and rot, drifting down from burning manufactorums, carried by winds that howled like wounded animals. The sound? A low, distant rumble. Some said it was thunder, but we knew better. We knew it was them. The first WAAAGH doesn't announce itself with words. There are no treaties, no broadcasts, no declarations. Just noise. A rolling wall of sound that builds day after day. The stomping, the pounding, the endless guttural laughter that shakes the ground before the bodies arrive. And then, the banners. Crude, ugly things stitched together from human skins, scrap metal, and symbols painted in blood. They fluttered in the smoke-choked winds long before we ever saw the beasts who carried them. We thought we had seen war before. Imperial Guard patrols, Arbeits purges, even the rare chaos cult dragged screaming into the square for execution. That was violence with rules, cruel, yes, but structured, restrained. But this was something else. When the first orc roared, the sound carried for miles. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was a declaration of existence, raw and brutal. And worse, it echoed inside our bones, like something had broken into us and demanded we listen. We wanted to believe the guard would hold, that the administratum had a plan, that the emperor, distant and silent, still cared enough to notice us. But hope is a fragile thing here, and the WAAAGH crushed it underfoot before the first bullet was fired. Because the truth is this: orcs don't just attack. They arrive like a storm. They arrive like a disease. And the world you thought you lived in, the rules, the structures, the certainties, all of it collapses in a single night. But that was only the beginning. Every world has its story, though most of us never know it. To the administratum, our home was just another name in a ledger, a productive agri-industrial world, stamped with quotas and export tallies. To us, it was simply the dirt we tilled, the manufactura where our backs broke, the cities where smoke scraped the skies until our eyes burned. We were not special. That was our curse. The Imperium has a way of grinding down the centuries until every memory of freedom is dust. They say our ancestors were once free settlers, pioneers who claimed this rock when the stars were still untamed. They built towns, carved soil, made families. Some even dared to dream. But dreamers don't last long in the galaxy of man. The administratum came first, dragging its scribes and tithe quotas behind it. Then the Arbeits, their black armor gleaming like oil slicks under false suns. Finally, the ecclesiarchy, whispering sermons about the golden throne, demanding obedience in exchange for salvation none of us would ever see. The world was divided, as all imperial worlds are. The spires for the nobles and overseers, shining above the smoke, while the rest of us rotted in habblocks that stank of fungus, sweat, and promethium leaks. We survived, but survival was never simple. Hunger was constant. Betrayals were common. Your neighbor might report you for a stolen ration, a whispered blasphemy, or nothing at all, just to shift suspicion from themselves. Every week someone disappeared into the darkness of the Arbeit cells, and their names were erased before the echoes of their screams faded. And yet, despite it all, there were myths, old stories, passed in whispers when the overseers weren't listening. Tales of saints who bled for the people, of martyrs who stood against impossible odds, even of Xenos, twisted into bedtime warnings. Eat your corpse starch or the greenskins will come. No one really believed it. Not then. But every myth has roots. And when the first reports came from the outer settlements, villages flattened overnight, the corpses gnawed, the sky shaking with laughter not human, those old bedtime threats became prophecy. We thought the Arbeits would investigate. We thought the guard would mobilize. Instead, the administratum marked the reports as localized disturbances. It was easier to believe the peasants had gone mad, or that heretics stirred rebellion, than to face the truth. After all, we were a productive world, and productive worlds do not fall. But history doesn't care for ledgers or quotas. History only cares for blood. And our world's history was about to be rewritten in the crude scrawl of greenskin glyphs, daubed in human gore. But if you want to understand what came next, you must first understand how we lived, day to day, hour to hour, before the storm truly broke. Because only then can you understand how fragile it all was if you want to understand what it means to live in the Imperium. Don't look at the soldiers. Don't look at the generals or the priests or the nobles in their spires. Look at us, the countless, the forgotten. We woke to the same sound every day, the tolling of the manufacturing bells, a metal groan that echoed across the city blocks like a funeral dirge. The air was already thick with soot, black flakes settling on our skin as though the sky itself were trying to bury us. You never really washed it off. No matter how hard you scrubbed, the black stayed in your pores, in your lungs, in your bones. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was a ration of corpse starch, pressed into bars that tasted like chalk soaked in grease. They said it was nutritionally complete. We said it was one step away from eating ash. Sometimes, if you had connections or were willing to trade away something precious, you might get a sliver of Grok's meat. But meat was for the lucky, or the corrupt. Then came the labor. For some, it was the manufacturer. Endless shifts at assembly lines that never stopped, building lasguns or loading Prometheum drums, their overseers barking down the lines with shock mauls ready. For others, it was the fields. Not green, not alive, but vast stretches of nutrient sludge farms, where you scraped the muck until your hands blistered and bled. The punishments were worse than the work. A man late by 5 minutes might be flogged until his back looked like shredded parchment. A woman who whispered doubts about the emperor might vanish into the cells beneath the ecclesiarchy shrine, her screams muffled by prayer chants. We learned early to keep our heads down, to endure, to whisper nothing, to want nothing. But faith was everywhere, whether we wanted it or not. Priests screamed sermons in the squares, spittle flying as they promised us salvation if only we obeyed. Children were marched into cathedral schools where they learned that suffering was holy, and that death in his name was the only path to worth. We believed because there was no other choice. And yet, despite all the fear, there were moments of strange humanity. A mother smuggling a crust of bread to her child. A man singing a forbidden folk song under his breath as machines roared around him. The flicker of a candle in a window, though open flame was forbidden in the hab blocks. Small acts, tiny rebellions, they were all we had. But survival was never safe. We learned to fear not just the Arbites or the priests, but each other. Your neighbor might report you for an extra ration bar. Your coworker might turn you in for muttering under your breath. We smiled at one another, shared the same cramped corridors, and all the while wondered, who will betray me first? That was life. That was normal. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we weren't ready. Because when the WAAAGH came, it tore through our fragile little routines like paper set to flame. And for the first time, we learned what true chaos really was. If life was suffering, then power was the hand that pressed our faces deeper into the dirt. We lived under a machinery of control so vast, so intricate, that most of us never even saw it fully. It wasn't meant to be seen. It was meant to be felt. The Arbites were the most visible. Black armored silhouettes patrolling the streets, visors blank, batons crackling with caged lightning. They didn't need to speak. Their silence was worse. If they stopped you, you didn't argue. You dropped to your knees and prayed they were only searching you, not taking you away. The unlucky ones were dragged screaming into black trucks that rolled off into the night. They never came back. Then there were the overseers in the manufactura. Gaunt men and women with augmetic eyes that never blinked. They carried shock mauls that hummed like angry insects. They didn't care if you worked yourself to death. In fact, death was just proof you had given enough. A body slumping on the assembly line was cleared away in seconds. Another worker shoved in to take their place. But the worst, some said, were the priests. The ecclesiarchy's grip was invisible but absolute. They filled our ears with sermons about obedience and sacrifice. They told us hunger was holy, that pain was proof of the emperor's love, that to suffer without question was to be truly human. We knew they lied, but the lie was all we had. Faith was both our comfort and our prison. On holy days, we were herded into cathedral squares, thousands of us kneeling on stone until our knees bled, while the priests burned incense so thick it made us choke. They waved relics, scraps of bone, rusted weapons, fragments of glass said to be touched by saints, and demanded we weep with joy at the sight of them. And when the crowd didn't weep loudly enough, the Arbites helped. Execution was a spectacle, public, loud, and cruel. A thief might be hanged by his entrails, his body left to rot above the marketplace for days. A heretic might be burned alive in the square, the priests chanting louder than the screaming, their voices hoarse from forced praise. Once they made an example of an entire block. Someone had whispered a forbidden word, and when no one confessed, the Arbites sealed the block's air vents. By morning, 400 people were corpses, their faces frozen in rictus terror. We learned the lesson. Survival meant obedience. And yet, there was irony in it all. The Imperium claimed to shield us from the horrors beyond, from the Xenos who lurked in the dark. But the truth? The cruelty we endured each day was so complete, so relentless, that when whispers came of warbands and greenskins on the horizon, some of us almost welcomed it. Not because we thought orcs would save us, but because at least the orcs would kill us quickly. And when the banners of the WAAAGH began to rise, painted in crude glyphs of blood and ash, that thought, that tiny, blasphemous wish for an ending, began to spread like a sickness among us. Because deep down we knew, whatever we suffered under the Imperium, what was coming would be worse. Much worse. The first sign was sound. Not the bells of the manufacturer, not the sermons of the priests, but something deeper, rawer. A low rumble that crawled through the ground, rattling windows, shaking loose dust from ceilings. Some thought it was an earthquake. Others swore it was a new engine test from the forges. But those of us who listened closely, we knew it was laughter. The second sign was smoke. Not the black, greasy clouds we lived under every day, but columns of red and green fire rising on the horizon. They lit the night in unnatural colors, shadows writhing like they were alive. The priests called them omens. The overseers called them minor disturbances. We called them what they were, a warning. The third sign was blood. Out in the farming zones, villages went silent overnight. Supply shipments never returned. A week later, the first refugees staggered in. Faces hollow, clothes torn, eyes wide with madness. They spoke in broken screams about monsters, about giants with green skin, about machines that roared like beasts. First, no one believed them, until the Arbites put them all to the torch for sedition. But burning their bodies didn't silence the truth. Their screams stayed in our ears. And when we saw the charred husks swinging in the squares, we knew they had been telling the truth. The horrors escalated as they always do. The next week, we heard the first boom. Not a shell, not a lost cannon, but something cruder, louder. An explosion that sent shockwaves through the city blocks, knocking tiles from rooftops, shattering glass in every spire. When we rushed to the streets, we saw a manufactorum reduced to rubble. Hundreds dead. And among the wreckage, shapes. Massive shapes. One of them was dragging a human arm like a toy. The guard mobilized then, far too late. Chimeras rumbled through the streets. Squads marched out into the wastes. We prayed for them. We hoped they might hold. But they didn't. The orcs didn't fight like men. They didn't fight like anything we understood. They came screaming from the dust storms, their guttural roars drowning out the guards' gunfire. Crude axes hacked through armor. Rusted guns spat fire louder than cannons. And when one orc fell, 2 more came laughing over its corpse. We saw it from the walls. Families clutched each other as the plains outside the hive city turned into a slaughterhouse. The guards' formations collapsed in minutes. And then came the machines. They weren't tanks, not really. They were nightmares welded together. Engines belching smoke, treads made from scavenged metal, spikes dripping with gore. Some had faces painted on their armor, crude snarls daubed in red. Others screamed as they moved, because human bodies had been nailed to their hulls, their throats torn open to make them into pipes. The ground shook as they advanced. And over it all, one word, one sound, carried by thousands of throats, echoing across the wastes, rolling through the hive city like thunder. WAAAGH! It wasn't just noise. It was a weapon. It crawled inside your skull, tore apart your courage, made you tremble even as you told yourself not to. We clutched our ears. We prayed. Some of us screamed back. But nothing stopped it. That was the moment we understood. The Imperium had promised us safety. The priests had promised us salvation. The overseers had promised us order. But all their promises shattered in a single night. And the WAAAGH was only just beginning. We had seen weapons before. Las guns, shock mauls, chainswords wielded by Arbites and guard alike. They were precise, clean, at least in their intent, if not their use. They killed you efficiently, with the Emperor's authority stamped on every discharge. But the orcs did not care for precision. Their weapons were something else entirely. The first time I saw an orc shoot, I almost laughed. The thing he carried was a slab of rusted metal bolted to a pipe, a crude drum of ammunition welded to the side, wires dangling loose. It looked like something a child might cobble together in a junk pile. And yet, when he pulled the trigger, it roared like a god of war. The blast tore 3 guardsmen apart in a single spray, bodies shredded into ribbons of meat. They called them shouldas. Crude, ugly, heavy. But they worked because the orcs believed they worked. And that belief was enough to make them real. Their melee weapons were worse. Axes forged from scavenged steel, blades jagged as broken teeth. Hammers the size of a man's chest, swung with enough force to turn skulls into pulp. Some carried chains so thick they dragged sparks from the ground, laughing as they wrapped them around human necks. And always, the weapons were oversized. Not because they needed to be, but because it made the killing more fun. But the real horror was their machines. We called them wagons, though that word was far too small. Imagine tanks built by madmen. Towers of jagged scrap, painted in crude glyphs, belching smoke so thick it turned day into night. They rattled and screamed as they moved, their guns stitched together from pipes and barrels, some firing shells so large the ground cracked with every shot. One of their war machines had a banner nailed to its side. Not cloth, but stretched human skin. Across it, painted in dripping red, was a single glyph, a jagged circle with teeth inside it. We didn't know what it meant. We didn't need to. It was enough to know it was a joke at our expense. Symbols mattered to them. We saw glyphs daubed in blood across walls, across the wreckage of hab blocks, across the corpses of our neighbors. Crude faces with tusks, circles with jagged lines. Some looked almost comical, like children's drawings. But that was the cruelty. To them, our suffering was a game, and every glyph was their laughter carved into the bones of our world. Even their armor was symbolic. Not uniform plates, not regulation colors, but scrap hammered into place, covered in spikes, daubed in red or black. Some wore helmets shaped like snarling beasts. Others simply painted their own faces with crude streaks of ash and blood. They didn't need to look terrifying. They already were. But they made themselves monstrous anyway, because fear itself was their weapon. And the banners, always the banners, they fluttered over every charge, stitched together from flesh, hides, and scavenged cloth, painted with the same crude marks. You could see them from miles away, a tide of color and gore that told us, we are coming, and nothing will stop us. We realized then that the orcs didn't just fight, they celebrated it. Their weapons weren't just tools of killing. They were symbols of mockery, of dominance, of inevitability. Where the Imperium told us our suffering was holy, the orcs told us it was funny. And in their laughter, we saw the truth. Our deaths would not even be tragedies. They would be punchlines. When the walls fell and the orcs poured in, the world split into 2 kinds of people. Those who clung to each other, and those who sharpened their knives for their neighbors. We saw resistance, of course. There are always the brave ones. Men and women who picked up las guns from the fallen, who formed barricades out of wreckage and scrap, who shouted hymns to the Emperor as they fired into the green tide. Some even held the line for a while, their courage burning like candles in the dark. But candles always burn out. We watched from the Hablock windows as one barricade after another was overrun. The orcs smashed through with roaring laughter, their axes flashing, their crude guns tearing men apart in sprays of blood. And when the defenders fell, their bodies weren't just left to rot. They were nailed to the barricades as trophies. Others chose betrayal, the kind of betrayal that comes from desperation. Some whispered to the overseers, trading information about hiding civilians for a chance to be spared. Some even tried to serve the orcs, painting crude glyphs on their doors, leaving out food, hoping the monsters would pass them by. It never worked. The orcs killed them anyway, sometimes quickly, sometimes not. But betrayal wasn't always so obvious. A man might slam his door shut on a fleeing neighbor, bolting it fast while screams echoed outside. A mother might abandon her starving child to save herself. A worker might point to the hiding place of strangers, just to keep the orcs distracted for one more minute. And then there were the small kindnesses, punished more brutally than anything else. I remember one night when an old man gave bread to a child who wasn't his. He whispered, "Eat quickly, little one, before they see." But they did see. A mob of orcs dragged him into the square, laughing as they tore him limb from limb, throwing the pieces into the crowd like gifts. The child screamed until his voice broke. Another time, a group of workers tried to smuggle families into the sewers, away from the raids. They were discovered before they'd gone 10 meters. The orcs didn't kill them right away. They made a game of it, chasing them through the tunnels, hacking pieces off, laughing as the screams echoed in the dark. Kindness, resistance, betrayal, it all blurred together in the end. And the paranoia grew. We looked at our neighbors and saw not friends, not kin, but potential traitors. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every hesitation carried the weight of death. If you trusted the wrong person, you might not live to regret it. We began to hide in silence, to move like ghosts through our own streets, to lock our doors and pray no one knocked. Some said resistance was still possible, that if enough of us banded together, we could hold. But most of us knew better. The Imperium had left us to burn, and the orcs were too many. So we endured, or we betrayed, or we died. And each choice carved another piece of our humanity away. Because in the shadow of the WAAAGH, even survival felt like treason. We thought the orcs were the only monsters. We were wrong. The longer the siege dragged on, the more the warp pressed its claws into us. Fear is a doorway, and our world had been cracked wide open. The prayers that once brought us comfort began to twist in our mouths, sour and jagged. The shadows in our corners no longer felt empty. They listened. At first, it was small things. People whispering to themselves at night, answering voices no one else could hear. Men who hadn't eaten in days suddenly raving with strength, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Children who screamed and couldn't stop, as though something was crawling under their skin. Then came the mutations. A woman in the lower habs grew a second mouth, tiny but shrieking, opening from her throat like a wound. A worker's arm hardened into a claw of bone and horn. A priest collapsed in the middle of a sermon, his tongue writhing like a serpent until it tore itself free. The ecclesiarchy called it heresy. They burned the afflicted, hanging their charred remains as warnings. But it spread anyway. You could feel it in the air, a pressure behind your eyes, a taste of copper in your mouth. The warp was here, seeping through the cracks of our fear, and some welcomed it. Desperation makes easy converts. When the Emperor's silence grew too heavy, other whispers took his place. Promises of strength, promises of survival, promises that if you carved a symbol into your flesh, if you drank from the blood pooling in the streets, you would live through the storm. We saw cults rise in the ruins, men and women daubed in ash and gore, chanting to names we dared not repeat. They claimed the warp was a gift, that the orcs were only the beginning, that something greater waited for those willing to embrace it. Some did. I remember one night when a family was cornered by orcs. Instead of running, the father drew a symbol across his chest in blood. The air around him warped, and fire crawled from his skin. For a heartbeat, he burned them back. But then he screamed. A A scream so sharp it split his jaw, and the fire consumed him, his family, and everything within reach. The orcs just laughed, because to them it was all the same. Human, mutant, cultist, priest, all just meat waiting to be torn apart. We began to fear not only the orcs but ourselves. The warp didn't need to corrupt all of us. It only needed a few, enough to spread madness like a disease, enough to make us turn on each other. And so the world rotted from both sides. The greenskin horde tearing us apart from without, the warp gnawing us hollow from within. The priests told us to endure. The cultists told us to embrace. But most of us just kept silent, waiting for whichever monster would reach us first. Because in the end, there was no difference. Whether it was the orcs' axes or the warp's whispers, the ending was the same. And yet, out of the ruins of our sanity, stories began to grow. Stories of those who resisted. Stories of those who betrayed. Stories of those who became something more or something far worse. Even in the middle of slaughter, we clung to stories. Not because they would save us, but because they gave shape to our fear. In the ruins, whispers spread faster than fire. Tales of those who resisted, those who betrayed, those who were consumed. We told them not as lessons, but as warnings. The martyr of Block 17, they say her name was Alira, a factory worker with hands scarred from years on the line. When the orcs broke into Block 17, she didn't run. Instead, she climbed to the top of the Hab Tower with nothing but a lost pistol and a lit promethium canister. She fired until the pistol clicked dry, then hurled herself into the mob below, flames consuming her and a dozen orcs with her. For days afterward, her burned silhouette was scorched into the stone. Some called it a miracle, others madness. The priests claimed it was proof of the Emperor's blessing. The rest of us just wondered what it felt like to choose the fire instead of waiting for the axe. The betrayer of the gate. There was another story, darker. A man named Kalthus, a mid-level overseer with connections to the Spire. When the orcs began hammering the city's eastern gate, he struck a bargain. He would lead them through a maintenance tunnel in exchange for his life. They say he even laughed as he guided them in, watching the guard die on the walls above. The orcs killed him anyway, not quickly. They left what was left of him nailed upside down to the gate, his entrails painted into a crude glyph. The message was clear. Betrayal was a human vice, not an orc one. The boy who wouldn't die this one is harder to believe, but it was whispered often. A child, no more than 12, found after 3 raids, still alive. He had been buried under rubble, crushed beneath bodies, hacked at with blades, but he lived. They said he laughed in the face of the orcs who tried to kill him, his body broken but his voice strong. Some claimed the WAAAGH avoided him after that, as though the orcs thought he was one of their own. Others claimed the warp had already claimed him. The truth? No one ever saw him twice. But the story lingered because in it, for just a moment, there was something like defiance. The Silent Saint Last was a myth, a figure seen in the smoke during the darkest nights. A woman in rags carrying a broken staff, her face hidden, her feet bare. They said she appeared wherever the dying lay, touching them once, and their screams would stop. Not healed, not saved, but silenced. Some said she was a saint of the Emperor, bringing mercy. Others said she was a demon, stealing souls. Either way, when someone died quietly, we whispered that the Silent Saint had passed by. These stories didn't save us. They didn't feed us. They didn't keep the orcs at bay. But they reminded us that even in the jaws of the WAAAGH, humanity left marks. Small, fleeting, bloody marks. And in the end, that was all the Imperium had ever promised us. To endure long enough to leave a scar before we were erased. But the scars of myth don't change reality. And reality was this. Our world was burning, our people were breaking, and the orcs were not done. Not by far. And so, when the smoke finally choked the sky and the fires devoured the last of the grain stores, there was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for the next raid, the next scream, the next WAAAGH banner rising above the horizon. We had learned the truth of the galaxy, a truth our ancestors never wanted to admit. The Imperium does not save. The orcs do not stop. Chaos does not forgive. There is no mercy here, no reprieve, no future. Only the endless cycle of war and the human dust caught between its turning gears. We used to ask ourselves, why us? Why this world? Why this fate? But there were no answers. The orcs did not come because of sin or destiny. They came because they were orcs, because they hungered for battle, and we happened to be in their path. To them, we were not souls, not people, not even prey. We were noise. We were fuel. And when you are seen as fuel, the only question left is how long before you burn out. Some prayed harder. Some cursed the Emperor's name. Some drank rotgut until their minds dissolved. A few laughed even as the axe came down, and in that laughter perhaps there was something like freedom. But for most of us, there was only the waiting. Waiting and the silence after each massacre. A silence that pressed against the skull, heavier than any orc's choppa. They say humans are resilient, that we endure, that we survive. But survival is not the same as living. Endurance is not the same as victory. And when all you inherit is rubble and memory, you begin to wonder. Perhaps the orcs are right. Perhaps the only truth in this galaxy is the WAAAGH, the roar, the fight. Because in the end, what did our prayers achieve? What did our tears earn us? What did our loyalty to the Imperium buy, except more graves and more lies? We endure until we cannot. We resist until resistance becomes dust. We hope until hope itself turns to madness. And when the last hab falls silent, when the last child's cry is lost to the thunder of orc engines, perhaps then the galaxy will not notice. Perhaps then the Imperium will not remember. Perhaps then we will vanish, nameless, faceless, swallowed whole. But even if that happens, we leave behind one truth. That we were here, that we suffered, that we died screaming, as the green tide washed over us, and that, in the great ledger of the stars, that scream, however brief, was ours.